The massive viewing deck of the Nexus Prime stretched out like a crystal cathedral in the void of space. Commander Jake Morrison stood near the wide windows, watching distant stars drift past as the flagship moved through hyperspace. His uniform was crisp and clean, but his hands showed the calluses and scars that marked him as someone who had seen real combat. Behind him, the soft murmur of alien voices filled the air as representatives from 12 different species mingled. In the reception area, Lieutenant Lisa Shang approached with 2 cups of what humans called coffee, but which most aliens found too bitter to drink. She handed one to Jake and nodded toward the crowd. The Zephyrians stood in a cluster near the central display, their crystal-like bodies catching and reflecting the ambient light in rainbow patterns. Their movements were graceful and precise, like living sculptures that had learned to walk. The Hydro's delegation stayed close to the humidity generators, their blue-green skin glistening with moisture that they needed to survive outside their water worlds. The Chitauri representatives moved in perfect synchronization, their insect-like bodies clicking and humming as they communicated through subsonic frequencies that only they could hear. "They seem excited about the training demonstrations," Lisa said, taking a sip of her coffee. Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had grown up on the lunar colonies, where every word was measured and careful because air was precious. Jake nodded and watched Admiral Crickstall of the Zephyrian fleet address the gathering. The alien's voice came through the universal translator as a melodic chime, but Jake had learned to read the subtle color changes in Zephyrian crystal that showed their true emotions. Right now, Crickstall was displaying the pale blue of condescension mixed with the yellow of curiosity. "Fellow warriors of the galaxy," Crickstall began, his crystal body shifting to a deeper blue as he spoke. "We gather here for the annual interspecies military exchange program. Each of our civilizations has developed unique methods of training our defenders. The Hydros have mastered combat in 3-dimensional aquatic environments. The Chitauri have perfected group tactics that function as a single mind. We Zephyrians have learned to fight using our natural crystal formations as both shield and weapon." The alien paused and turned his faceted head toward the human delegation. Jake felt the weight of dozens of non-human eyes focusing on him and his team. Sergeant Ben Parker, who had been quietly eating what the food dispensers labeled as protein cubes, looked up with the expression of someone who had heard this speech before. "And our newest members," Crickstall continued, the yellow in his crystal growing brighter, "the humans from the world they call Earth, a planet so hostile that we have classified it as a Class 12 death world. We are most curious to see how beings from such a harsh environment have adapted their military training." Jake heard the subtle emphasis on the word harsh and caught the ripple of what might have been laughter from the Chitauri delegation. He had learned enough about galactic politics to understand what was really being said. The aliens saw Earth as a brutal, primitive world, and they expected human military training to be equally brutal and primitive. Dr. Veltar of the Hydros delegation stepped forward, his webbed hands making the graceful gestures that his people use for formal speech. "Perhaps the humans can show us how they have learned to survive in such challenging conditions," he said through his translator. The device rendered his words in a gentle, flowing tone, but Jake caught the undertone of amusement. Ben Parker set down his protein cube and stood up. At nearly 2 meters tall and built like he had spent his life lifting heavy things, he towered over most of the alien delegates. Several Chitauri took an instinctive step backward. "We'd be happy to demonstrate our training methods," he said, in his slow, careful voice. "Though we might need to make some adjustments?" "Adjustments?" asked Hivemind Zikanash, speaking for the Chitauri delegation. The insectoid's compound eyes reflected the room's light in a way that humans found unsettling. Though Jake had grown used to it, Lisa stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over. "Our standard facilities might be ... tense for species not adapted to Earth normal conditions. We would need to modify our training station to ensure the safety of all observers." Admiral Crickstall's crystal body shifted to pure yellow. The color Jake had learned indicated amusement. Surely the training methods of a single world cannot be more challenging than what our advanced civilizations have developed over millennia. Jake exchanged a glance with Ben and Lisa. They had talked about this moment during the long journey to the Nexus Prime. Earth's military had been invited to join the galactic community only 5 years ago, and they were still considered the newcomers, the primitives who had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Most aliens viewed humans as an interesting curiosity from a dangerous world, like studying how insects survived in toxic environments. "We appreciate your confidence," Jake said carefully. "But our training incorporates conditions that are normal for humans but might be problematic for other species." Dr. Veltar made the Hydros gesture for polite dismissal. "Commander Morrison, we have studied your world's conditions through long-range sensors. While Earth is indeed more geologically active and climatically variable than most inhabited planets, surely trained military personnel can adapt to any reasonable training environment." The other delegates murmured agreement. Jake could see the mixture of curiosity and condescension in their expressions. They wanted to see human training methods the same way scientists might want to observe how cave fish had adapted to darkness. They expected to witness crude but effective techniques developed by beings who had been forced to fight for survival on a hostile world. "Very well," Jake said, making his decision. "We can arrange a demonstration at Training Station Omega 7. It's one of our more accessible facilities." Ben Parker's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Lisa took another sip of her coffee to hide her expression. They all knew that Omega 7 was what human military classified as a basic conditioning facility, used primarily for new recruits who had never seen combat. Admiral Crystal's crystal body flashed bright yellow with pleasure. "Excellent. We shall arrange transport immediately. This will be most educational for all of our species." As the alien delegates began discussing logistics and scheduling, Jake walked back to the viewing windows. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance across the darkness. He thought about the human recruits currently training on Omega 7, young men and women who were learning to fight in conditions that would kill most of the beings in this room within minutes. The humans had not lied about needing to make modifications to their training facility. They would indeed need to adjust things to ensure their alien guests could survive the experience. The question was whether the aliens would survive the revelation of what humans considered normal training conditions. Jake finished his coffee and watched the stars. In a few days, the galaxy was going to learn something new about the species from the little blue world that everyone called a death world. He just hoped the aliens were ready for the lesson. The transport shuttle moved away from the Nexus Prime like a silver needle threading through space. Jake Morrison sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls as he guided them toward the gas giant that dominated the view screen. Behind him, the alien delegates were strapped into seats that had been specially modified for their different physiologies. The Zephyrians had insisted on crystal-lined restraints that would not interfere with their light-based communication. The Hydros required additional moisture systems to keep their skin from drying out during the journey. The Chitauri had linked themselves together with biocables so they could maintain their hive mind connection. Dr. Amanda Foster, the human training coordinator, turned in her seat to address their guests. Her voice was calm and professional, the tone of someone who had spent years explaining dangerous procedures to nervous students. "Training Station Omega 7 is located in orbit around Titan-class gas giant designated as Romeo 4, she said. "The station maintains standard Earth-normal conditions for our human trainees." Admiral Crystal's crystal body flickered with pale green curiosity. "Earth-normal conditions," he repeated through his translator. "Please clarify these parameters for our safety records." Amanda consulted her data pad with the casual air of someone reading a grocery list. "Atmospheric pressure is maintained at 1 Earth atmosphere, which translates to approximately 101.3 kilopascals. Gravity is set to 1.2. Earth normal to provide enhanced conditioning benefits. Temperature ranges from 18 to 24 degrees Celsius in the living areas. Though training zones can vary significantly, she paused and looked up from her pad. Oh, and radiation levels are kept within human safety margins, which should be perfectly fine for short-term exposure. Dr. Veltar of the Hydros delegation made a sound that his translator rendered as concern. His blue-green skin had begun to take on a darker shade, which Jake had learned was their species' version of nervousness. When you say 1.2 Earth gravity, Veltar said slowly, are you aware that Earth gravity is nearly 3 times what most civilized worlds consider comfortable? Lisa Chang turned from her position at the navigation console. We chose one of our lighter training facilities specifically for this demonstration, she said with what sounded like helpfulness. Most of our advanced stations operate at much higher gravitational stress levels. The Chitauri delegation began that low humming sound they made when they were communicating rapidly among themselves. Hivemind Zikanash spoke for the group, his insectoid voice carrying a note of what the translator interpreted as alarm. The radiation levels you mention as safe for humans, he said. Our preliminary calculations suggest they would be lethal to most of our species within 4 to 6 hours. Amanda looked surprised, then consulted her datapad again. Oh my, she said with genuine concern. I had no idea other species were so sensitive to what we consider background radiation. We'll definitely need to provide you with protective gear. Ben Parker, who had been quietly checking weapon systems, looked over his shoulder. The protective suits are already loaded in the cargo bay, he said. Full environmental protection, radiation shielding, gravity compensation systems, and emergency life support good for about 8 hours. As they drew closer to Training Station Omega-7, the alien delegates got their first look at what humans considered a basic training facility. The station was a massive structure that looked like someone had built a small city inside a series of interconnected spheres and cylinders. It bristled with antenna arrays, weapon emplacements, and what appeared to be launch bays for small craft. The whole complex orbited the gas giant at a distance that put it directly in the planet's intense radiation belt. The station is positioned to take advantage of the natural radiation environment, Amanda explained as they approached the docking bay. It helps condition our trainees for combat in hostile space environments. The gravitational shear from the gas giant also provides excellent training conditions for spatial orientation exercises. Admiral Krickstall's crystal body had shifted to a deep purple that Jake recognized as growing concern. When you say combat in hostile space environments, the alien asked, are you referring to emergency survival situations? Oh no, Amanda replied, cheerfully. Standard combat doctrine assumes that humans will be fighting in environments that are actively trying to kill them. Radiation exposure, extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, crushing pressures, that sort of thing. Our training reflects those expectations. The docking bay doors opened to reveal a chamber that was larger than most alien warships. Jake guided the shuttle inside, and the alien delegates watched through the viewports as hundreds of figures in what appeared to be heavy armor moved through the bay with practiced efficiency. The humans moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible under the crushing gravity that would have left most aliens unable to stand. Those are our current trainees, Ben said, noting their attention. Basic conditioning program, mostly teenagers, and young adults learning fundamental combat skills. Dr. Veltar made a sound that did not translate well. Those are children, he said, his voice rising in pitch the way it did when hydros were distressed. You are training children in an environment that would kill experienced warriors from most species. Lisa turned to face the alien delegates, and Jake caught the expression on her face. She was beginning to understand just how different human and alien perspectives on training really were. The minimum age for military training on Earth is 16, she said carefully, though most of these recruits are between 18 and 20 years old. The shuttle settled into the docking bay with a gentle thud that seemed too soft for the massive gravitational forces at work. Jake began the shutdown procedures while Amanda activated the station's communication systems. Her voice echoed through the bay as she announced their arrival. Attention all personnel, we have VIP visitors from the Interspecies Exchange Program. Standard protocols are in effect. Remember that our guests are not adapted to Earth-normal conditions. The alien delegates were now strapping on the protective gear that the humans had provided. The suits were bulky and clearly designed for much smaller beings trying to survive in conditions that exceeded their biological limits. Admiral Crickstall struggled with his suit's helmet, his crystal appendages making the simple task difficult. "These protective systems," he said as Jake helped him with the connections, "they are quite sophisticated." "Are they standard issue for your military personnel?" Jake shook his head. "No, sir," he replied. "These are civilian-grade emergency suits. Our military personnel train without protection to build up natural resistance." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of life support systems and the distant sound of what the aliens were beginning to realize was not machinery, but the sound of hundreds of young humans training under conditions that would be considered a death sentence by most of galactic civilization. As the shuttle's doors opened and the alien delegates got their first taste of training station Omega-7's atmosphere, Jake wondered if they had made a mistake in agreeing to this demonstration, but it was too late now. The aliens were about to learn what humans meant when they talked about basic military training. The observation deck overlooked what humans called the primary training area, but what looked to the alien delegates like a carefully designed torture chamber. Admiral Crickstall pressed his crystal face against the reinforced viewing window, his body flickering between purple concern and yellow disbelief as he watched the scene below. Through his protective suit's communication system, he could hear his own breathing becoming rapid and shallow. In the arena below, a group of human recruits were beginning what Dr. Amanda Foster had cheerfully described as their morning warm-up routine. The young humans, most barely out of their teens, moved with a casual confidence that made the watching aliens feel sick. They wore simple training clothes that offered no protection from the environment that surrounded them. The gravity in the training area is set to 1.5 Earth normal, Amanda explained, her voice coming through the intercom with the tone of someone discussing the weather. "We find that enhanced gravity helps build muscle density and cardiovascular endurance more quickly." Ryan Kelly, a recruit with sandy hair and the kind of easy smile that made him look younger than his 20 years, jogged to the starting line of what appeared to be an obstacle course. Behind him, Maria Santos adjusted the straps on a backpack that looked large enough to hold a week's worth of supplies. Both humans moved as if the crushing gravity that was making the alien observers feel dizzy was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Dr. Veltar of the Hydros delegation made a sound like water being forced through a narrow pipe. Even through his environmental suit, the enhanced gravity was making him feel like his internal organs were being compressed. "Those packs," he said, his voice strained. "What do they contain?" Amanda consulted her datapad. "Standard training." "Load," she said. 40 kilograms of equipment, including emergency rations, water purification tablets, basic medical supplies, ammunition, and backup communication gear. The Chitauri delegation began their rapid-fire humming communication, the sound rising in pitch as they shared what could only be described as panic. Hive Mind Zikanash spoke for the group, his translator struggling to render the emotional undertones of his words. 40 kilograms, he repeated, in 1.5 gravity. That would be equivalent to carrying 60 kilograms under normal conditions. That's, correct, Amanda replied, seeming pleased that the aliens were following the mathematics. Our recruits find it builds excellent core strength. Ryan Kelly had reached the first obstacle, a wall that stretched upward into the dim light of the training area ceiling. The wall was not smooth but covered with handholds that were spaced, just far enough apart to require significant reach and strength to use. Without hesitation, Ryan began climbing, his movements fluid and controlled despite the pack on his back and the crushing gravity that was making it difficult for the aliens to even stand upright. Behind him, Maria Santos waited her turn, stretching muscles that the aliens were beginning to realize were far more powerful than they appeared. Her casual movements suggested strength that would have been considered superhuman by most galactic species. Admiral Crystal's crystal body had shifted to a deep red that Jake Morrison recognized as fear. "How high is that wall?" the alien asked, though he seemed afraid to hear the answer. 12 meters, Amanda replied. "Not particularly challenging, but adequate for building confidence in new recruits." The alien delegates watched in growing horror as Ryan reached the top of the wall and began his descent on the far side. What they saw next made several of them step back from the viewing window. Instead of climbing down carefully, Ryan rappelled down a rope at a speed that would have been suicidal for any of their species. At the bottom, he landed in what appeared to be a pool of water, but as the aliens watched, they realized the water was moving in ways that defied the station's artificial gravity. Maria Santos followed, hitting the water with a splash that sent waves in all directions. "The aquatic obstacle," Amanda explained, "simulates combat conditions in hostile water environments. The pool is kept at 4 degrees Celsius and the current generators create flow patterns equivalent to Class 3 rapids." Dr. Veltar made a sound that his translator rendered as a whimper. Even his own species, adapted for aquatic life, considered water that cold to be potentially lethal. Watching the human recruits swim through it as if it were a pleasant bath was making his protective suit's temperature regulators work overtime. As Ryan and Maria emerged from the freezing water, they were immediately faced with what appeared to be a maze constructed from metal barriers. The aliens could see strobing lights flashing between the barriers, and even through the soundproofed observation deck, they could hear the rumble of some kind of sonic equipment. "Sensory overload?" "Training," Amanda said, noting their attention. "The recruits must navigate through the maze while being subjected to disorienting lights, sound patterns designed to interfere with inner ear function, and mild electrical stimulation." Hive mind Zikanash's compound eyes were reflecting the strobing lights from below in patterns that suggested his entire nervous system was being overwhelmed just from watching. "Mild electrical stimulation," he repeated in a voice that barely functioned. "Nothing dangerous," Amanda assured him. "Just enough to simulate the disorientation that comes from electromagnetic weapons fire or damaged equipment during combat." The human recruits entered the maze without hesitation, their movements becoming more deliberate as they adapted to the sensory assault that was making the alien observers feel physically ill. Through their suits' communication systems, the aliens could hear each other breathing heavily, and several were making sounds of distress that did not translate well. "Captain." Alex Turner appeared beside Amanda at the observation window. He was older than the recruits below, with the weathered look of someone who had seen actual combat, and his casual presence seemed to radiate a competence that the aliens found both impressive and terrifying. "How are our guests doing?" Alex asked, glancing at the alien delegates who were now huddled together near the back of the observation deck. "I think they're beginning to understand the differences in our training approaches," Amanda replied diplomatically. Alex nodded and looked down at the training area where Ryan and Maria had emerged from the maze and were now approaching what appeared to be a series of mechanical opponents. The robots were designed to look like simplified versions of various predatory animals, and they moved with the fluid aggression of hunters. "Hand-to-hand combat simulation," Alex explained to the aliens, though several of them seemed to have stopped listening. "The machines are programmed to simulate the attack patterns of Earth's apex predators. Lions, bears, large primates, that sort of thing." Admiral Crystal's crystal body had gone completely transparent, which Jake had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of fainting. Dr. Veltar was making continuous sounds of distress, and the Chitauri delegation had linked together in what appeared to be a group panic response. As the mechanical predators began their attack simulation and the human recruits responded with movements that demonstrated reflexes and combat skills that no other species could match, Amanda finally began to understand what they had done. The aliens were not just observing human training methods. They were witnessing the casual demonstration of capabilities that made humans the most dangerous species in known space, and this was what humans considered basic training for beginners. The medical bay of Training Station Omega-7 had never seen so many alien patients at once. Dr. Veltar lay on a specialized treatment table, while human medics worked to stabilize his failing respiratory system. His blue-green skin had turned an alarming shade of gray, and the moisture levels in his environmental suit had reached critical levels. Admiral Crystal sat in a corner, his crystal body flickering weakly between transparent and pale yellow, while a human nurse checked the power levels on his life support systems. The Chitauri delegation had linked themselves together in what their species called a recovery formation, their biocables creating a web of shared consciousness that helped them process the trauma of what they had witnessed. Hive Mind Zikanash spoke for the group in short, broken sentences that their translator struggled to render into coherent speech. "We did not understand," he said, his compound eyes reflecting the medical bay's lights and patterns that suggested deep confusion. "We thought we were watching training. But those were impossible things. Humans doing impossible things." Sergeant Nicole Brooks entered the medical bay carrying what appeared to be a simple duffel bag. She moved with the same casual confidence that had characterized all the human personnel they had met. But now the aliens understood that this confidence came from capabilities that exceeded anything they had previously encountered in galactic civilization. "Commander Morrison asked me to show our guests some of our standard equipment," Nicole said, setting the bag down on a nearby table. "He thought it might help explain some of the things you observed during the training demonstration." She opened the bag and began laying out items that looked like they belonged in a survival museum rather than a military kit. There was a compact device that she identified as a water purification system capable of making any liquid safe for human consumption. A small medical kit that contained tools for treating wounds that would kill most aliens instantly. A fire-starting kit designed to work in environments with little or no oxygen. "Every human soldier carries these basic supplies," Nicole explained, holding up what appeared to be a simple knife, but which her casual handling suggested was far more dangerous than it looked. "The assumption is that we will be operating in environments where normal supply lines cannot reach us." Dr. Veltar managed to speak, though his voice was weak and distorted by his failing respiratory system. "Those environments," he said, "the ones you plan to operate in, are they the same as your training conditions?" Nicole looked confused by the question. "Oh, no," she said. "Training conditions are much safer than actual combat zones. We can't risk serious injury during training exercises." The silence that followed was broken only by the humming of life support systems and the occasional beeping of medical monitors. The alien delegates stared at Nicole with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the universe. Admiral Crystal's crystal body managed a brief flash of yellow, which Jake Morrison recognized as an attempt at communication. "When you say serious injury," the alien managed, "what do you mean?" Nicole thought for a moment, as if trying to explain something so obvious that she had never needed to put it into words before. "Well, permanent disability or death, obviously. Training injuries should be minor. Broken bones, torn muscles, mild concussions, that sort of thing. Nothing that won't heal completely within a few weeks." Hive Mind Zikanash made a sound that did not translate at all, though the emotional content was clear enough. The Chitauri concept of minor injury apparently did not include things that would be considered life-threatening trauma by most species. "I think," Dr. Amanda Foster said carefully, "that we may need to recalibrate our understanding of what constitutes reasonable training conditions." Jake Morrison entered the medical bay at that moment, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to grasp the full scope of what had happened. Behind him came Lieutenant Kevin Wright, a compact man with the kind of wiry build that suggested endurance rather than raw strength. Kevin carried a small device that he set up near the alien delegates. "This is a standard emergency beacon," Kevin explained, activating the device. "Every human soldier carries one. It's designed to function in extreme conditions and can transmit through most kinds of interference." The device began displaying environmental readings from Training Station Omega-7. The aliens watched as numbers scrolled across the screen, showing radiation levels, atmospheric pressure, gravity readings, and temperature fluctuations that painted a picture of conditions that should have been uninhabitable. "These readings," Admiral Crystal said, his crystal body flickering as he struggled to process the information, "they indicate an environment that our species classify as actively hostile to life." "Right," Kevin agreed. "That's why we chose this location for basic training. It helps prepare our people for the kinds of conditions they'll encounter in actual combat situations." Dr. Veltar made another sound that his translator could not render. Through his failing communication system, he managed to ask the question that was terrifying all of them. "If this is basic training, what do you consider advanced preparation?" The humans in the room exchanged glances, and Jake Morrison made a decision that would change galactic military doctrine forever. "Kevin," he said, "show them the Special Forces selection criteria." Kevin activated another function on his device, and new data began scrolling across the screen. The environmental parameters that appeared made the current training station look like a pleasant vacation resort. Temperature extremes that ranged from Arctic cold to volcanic heat. Atmospheric conditions that included toxic gases and pressure levels that would crush most alien physiology. Radiation exposure that would be lethal to most species within minutes. "Special Forces candidates," Kevin explained matter-of-factly, "must demonstrate the ability to operate effectively in any environment that exists naturally on inhabited worlds. The selection process involves live training in active war zones, survival exercises in extreme climate conditions, and psychological conditioning, designed to maintain combat effectiveness under stress levels that would incapacitate most individuals." The medical monitors attached to the alien delegates began showing readings that suggested severe psychological trauma. Dr. Veltar's respiratory system was failing faster, and Admiral Crystal had gone completely transparent again. The Chitauri delegation had stopped trying to communicate entirely, their bio-cables pulsing with patterns that suggested their group consciousness was struggling to process the information. Nicole Brooks, who had been quietly organizing her equipment, looked up at the alien delegates with genuine concern. "Are you all going to be okay?" she asked. "We have medical staff who specialize in treating non-human physiology if you need additional support." The question hung in the air like a challenge that none of the aliens could answer. They had come to observe primitive training methods used by beings from a dangerous world. Instead, they had discovered that humans routinely prepared their young people to survive and fight in conditions that would exterminate most galactic civilization. As the medical staff worked to stabilize their alien patients, Jake Morrison walked to the viewing window that looked out over the training area. Below, human recruits continued their exercises, moving through environmental challenges that represented certain death for most species. They did it with the casual competence of apex predators who had never encountered anything they could not eventually overcome. The aliens were not just observing human military training. They were witnessing the systematic preparation of the most dangerous species in known space, and they were beginning to understand that Earth's classification as a death world was not just about the planet's hostile environment. It was about what that environment had created. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 3 days after the alien delegates returned from Training Station Omega-7. Admiral Crystal attended virtually, his crystal body still too fragmented from trauma to travel, while Dr. Veltar appeared through a specialized aquatic chamber that kept him stable enough to participate. The Chitauri delegation had required emergency psychological reconstruction, and Hivemind Zikanash spoke through a heavily filtered communication system that protected the rest of his consciousness from further shock. Commander Jake Morrison sat at the witness table in the center of the Great Assembly Hall, watching as representatives from 47 different species discussed what they had learned about human military capabilities. The conversation had been going on for hours, and Jake could see the fear in their expressions as they struggled to understand what humanity represented in the broader galactic community. "The question before this council," announced High Arbiter Velanara, whose species had evolved on a world so peaceful that they had never developed concepts for warfare, is whether the human military represents a threat to galactic stability, or whether their unique capabilities should be integrated into our collective defense systems. Captain Danny Lewis, Humanity's Special Forces liaison, stood to address the assembly. His presence alone seemed to make many of the alien delegates nervous, though he moved with the controlled calm of someone who had spent years learning to appear non-threatening. The scars on his hands and face told a different story about the environments he had survived. "Honored delegates," Danny began, his voice carrying the steady tone of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to people who did not want to understand them. "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about what you observed at our training facility." He activated a holographic display that showed environmental data from various worlds throughout the galaxy. Green indicators marked planets that most species considered habitable. Yellow showed worlds that required technological support to survive, and red indicated conditions that were considered lethal to most forms of life. "What you witnessed was not advanced human military training," Danny continued. "It was basic conditioning for civilian recruits. The environmental parameters at Training Station Omega-7 represent what we consider minimum survival conditions." The display changed to show data from Earth itself, and a wave of shocked sounds rippled through the assembly as they saw that their homeworld was marked in deep red across almost every environmental category. Hurricane-force winds, temperature variations that spanned more than 100 degrees, atmospheric pressure changes that would crush most alien physiology, and radiation exposure from their sun that required constant biological adaptation. Dr. Veltar managed to speak through his aquatic chamber, though his voice was still weak from his experience at the training station. "Are you saying that all humans are trained to military standards?" he asked, "or that your military training is equivalent to normal civilian life on your world?" Danny paused, considering how to answer a question that revealed just how different human and alien perspectives really were. "Every human child learns basic survival skills as part of normal development," he said finally. "The ability to find shelter, purify water, treat injuries, and defend themselves against environmental hazards. What you would classify as military training, we consider elementary education." The assembly hall fell silent except for the humming of life support systems and the occasional sound of an alien delegate making distressed noises. High Arbiter Velinara's skin had shifted to the pale color that her species displayed when confronting concepts that challenged their understanding of reality. Admiral Crystal's fragmented crystal body managed to flicker with enough coherence to ask the question that was terrifying them all. "If basic human conditioning exceeds our most advanced military capabilities," he said, "what do you train your actual warriors to fight?" Danny looked at Jake Morrison, who nodded permission to continue. This was the moment they had known would come, when humanity would have to reveal the truth about their place in the universe and why Earth's military had developed the way it had. "Our planet," Danny said, "has been preparing for war against opponents that do not yet exist. Every training protocol, every survival standard, every combat technique has been developed under the assumption that we will eventually encounter enemies whose capabilities exceed anything that currently exists in galactic civilization." He activated another display, showing theoretical combat scenarios that included environmental hazards beyond anything the aliens had imagined. Warfare in the vacuum of space, combat on planets with crushing gravity and toxic atmospheres, battles against opponents with technological capabilities that had not yet been invented. "We discovered early in our development that the universe is not a safe place," Danny continued. "Our planet taught us that survival requires preparation for the worst possible conditions. And our military doctrine assumes that somewhere in the galaxy there are threats that make our training conditions look comfortable." Hive Mind Zikanash made a sound through his filtered communication system that suggested his entire consciousness was struggling to process this information. "You have been preparing to fight enemies that you have never encountered," he said. "And your preparation involves conditions that would destroy most known civilizations." "That's correct," Danny replied. And now that we have joined the galactic community, we realize that what we thought was basic preparedness actually represents capabilities that exceed most military forces in known space. The silence that followed was broken by High Arbiter Velanara, who had been consulting with advisors from multiple species. "The Council has reached a preliminary decision," she announced. "Human training methods are to be classified as restricted Deathworld protocols, and a new category of military classification will be created for species that have evolved under conditions that exceed normal galactic parameters." She paused and looked directly at Jake Morrison. "We are also prepared to offer humanity a unique position within galactic defense structures, not as junior partners learning from more advanced civilizations, but as specialists in extreme environment combat and survival training." Jake stood and addressed the assembly with the same calm competence that had characterized every human they had met. "We accept the classification and the position," he said, "but I want to make one thing clear to this council. What you observed at our training station represents our absolute minimum standards for preparedness. If you want to understand what human military forces are truly capable of, you would need to observe our advanced training protocols." The alien delegates made sounds of distress that did not require translation. They had seen what humans considered basic training, and the idea of witnessing advanced human military capabilities was clearly more than their psychological systems could handle. As the session concluded and alien delegates began filing out of the assembly hall, many of them walking carefully as if they were still recovering from trauma, Jake Morrison realized that humanity's relationship with the rest of the galaxy had changed forever. They were no longer the curious newcomers from a dangerous world. They were the apex predators that other species would call upon when the universe revealed threats that exceeded normal civilizational responses, and somewhere in the deep space beyond the galactic rim, unknown dangers waited for opponents who had trained their entire species to fight wars that had not yet begun.